Welcome back. Amidst the turmoil in the Middle East in the past couple of months, Egypt has continued to be an area of focus. According to a Toronto Star report, Al Jazeera journalists, including Egyptian-Canadian Mohammed Fahmy, have been imprisoned by the Egyptian courts for 7 to 10 years. What is the role of the average Muslim when it comes to issues related to justice and freedom of speech? How do Muslims view oppression and those that are oppressed within the Islamic context? Dr. Shabir Ali is joining me to share his thoughts. Dr. Shabir, let's get right into it. What is the Quranic perspective when it comes to oppression, so those that are oppressed and those who do the oppressing?
In fact, the Quran shows that God is on the side of the oppressed. In the Quran, in the second chapter, in the 279th verse, there is a strong condemnation of oppression, and the Quran speaks of one type of oppression here, which from the Quranic perspective has God coming in and saying, okay, be aware of a war with God on this. And of course, if God is at war with you, then God help you. Elsewhere in the Quran, there is much about oppression, which is referred to as zulm in the Arabic. And the Quran assures us that God himself is not a zallam or an oppressor to his servants, and he calls on his servants to not oppress each other. A hadith speaking about this says that God has forbidden oppression for himself, and he has likewise forbidden it for you. So you're not to oppress each other. And the contrast to that is for people to stand up for justice.
What do we say? Because we often hear, leaders within the community saying, "Be patient." What is the response that we're patient and we let the oppression happen, or how does that work?
No, patience requires that we are doing everything we can to right the wrongs and to ensure justice, but at the end, or through this whole process, we are still patient with God, waiting for God to bring about the results in his own time and on his schedule. In terms of working for justice, the Quran tells us, O you who believe, كُمُوا قَوَّامِينَ بِالْقِسْطِ شُهَدَاءَ لِلَّهِ. You should stand up for justice, being witnesses for God. And then it continues to say that even if it is against your own self or against your own people or against even your father or your mother, you have to stand up for justice, not being partisan and letting your partisanship steer you away from justice.
So of particular interest to Canadians is the case of Khalid al-Kazaz. He's a permanent Canadian resident. His wife is Canadian and he has Canadian children. And he's been held without charge as a result of the Morsi government that was recently toppled, and we're nearing now approximately 500 days. What is the response there?
Well, Muslims need to rise on this occasion as well and say we stand up for justice. There's no excuse for a Muslim majority country to be committing such acts of injustice. And so Muslims should be appalled for two reasons, Muslim Canadians here. One reason as Muslims, and the second reason as Canadians. Not necessarily in that order, but as Muslims, we reflect on the Quran, which tells us again and again, stand up for justice, be just, do not be unjust. And then if Muslims turn around and commit acts of injustice, it's very clear then that we're not really following the Quran.
So how can we stand up for justice? Because as you know, he's a Canadian permanent resident, even though his wife and his family are Canadian citizens over here. And then the other part of that is we're here, for example, right now in Toronto, and he's being held without charge all the way in Egypt. What can we as a community do to stand up for justice? As you've pointed out, it's our obligation as per what the Quran says.
Yeah, well, as Canadians, we feel for our fellow Canadian residents, and we want to help anyone for that matter, but since he is a fellow resident, we want to help him too. And we want to make sure that justice is done. And we can't say this is somebody else's problem because he's in another country. No, it could be any one of us stuck in any country, whether we went as tourists or for whatever reason, and we're being held up by an unjust system. We need the help of our fellow Canadians, of our government, to rescue us from these difficult situations. We need people to stand up for justice regardless where the injustice is being committed. We need to speak against that, whether as Canadians or as Muslims or as Muslim Canadians. We have all of the reasons for ensuring that justice is being done.
So participating in campaigns, for example, that raise awareness about this case to the government and other officials?
Yes, we have to ask our governments to raise this as a special problem in their diplomatic encounters with other countries. One of the frustrating things for many of the Muslim youth, and that feeds into the radicalization of Muslim youth at the present time, is their perception that the Muslim governments are puppets for foreign governments, and that many of the injustices that are being committed in Muslim lands are just simply ignored by the countries that should be there policing and helping to ensure that justice is being done. So if, for example, Canada has a good relationship with Egypt, and that relationship is preserved, and that leads to good for both Egypt and Canada, but at the same time Canada ignores the injustices that are being done there, especially injustice to Canadian citizens and permanent residents, then people ask where's the justice and where's the fairness, and they see that there is a certain degree of hypocrisy in the Western nations. And this feeds into their radical ideologies, which says that basically we have to do something ourselves, something drastic, something radical, because nobody is there to help us, nobody is stepping in to ensure justice, so we have to change the system, and they employ radical means. They're wrong, but to help to root out this radicalization, it is important that we look at all of the factors, and this seems to be one of the factors.
So on that note, Muslim youth in particular are definitely feeling the frustrations. What other venues can they use to, obviously to some, maybe this type of radicalized Islam might be an attraction because they're thinking no one else is doing anything. These are people that are doing something, whether they're right or they're wrong, and the youth know this, but maybe that's the only outlet that they see. What is the response?
Well,
there?
first of all, we need to see that this radical response is a dead-end road. It doesn't lead to any good. Violence just breeds more violence. And we are seeing now in the case of ISIS, which thinks that it's doing something good, even though it has had some momentary gains. Now the entire world seems to be against them, with coalition forces bombarding them. They're not going to succeed. Of course, one might say with the help of God, yes, we will succeed. But God's help also comes to people who are doing good things in the appropriate way. You cannot say that you have the good intentions and therefore God is going to help you. You cannot do wrong things, as groups like ISIS are doing, imposing faith on people, capturing women, and so on. This is not what our religion actually teaches, even though one may go back in history and find some sort of justification for what they're doing. One has to see the difference between the historical circumstance and our present circumstance to see that they are misapplying certain procedures, thinking that they're doing it right, but of course they haven't seen how the circumstances and the world has changed to the extent that those same procedures would not be appropriate in the new circumstance. And if our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, were alive today, he would do many things very differently than he did some 1400 years ago. So to follow the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, today means to understand how he, as a wise and practical person, would have acted in our present circumstance, and that's what we need to do, not specifically and necessarily what the Prophet, peace be upon him, did in a very different circumstance. So with this kind of misunderstanding, we see that ISIS and other such groups are misrepresenting the faith, and though they may have some traditional elements that seem attractive to the youth who want to see those traditional elements, and they don't seem to see it elsewhere, the youth need to recognize that that radical response is a dead-end street. So we need to try other avenues.
So as we wrap up this talk, one last point. We often hear, young Muslim youth also saying that a lot of community leaders or faith leaders say, make sure you pray because prayer is the weapon of the believer. How does this fit into proactively advocating and speaking for justice, but then also balancing our, religious obligations?
Well, as much as we need to lobby our members of parliament and government more generally, we also need to lobby God. And that's the way we do it, by lifting our hands in prayer, by being on our prayer mats, putting our foreheads on the floor, and saying, God, please help us, because we're trying everything else, but ultimately you are the one who has to decide that we're going to get this help.
And that's where patience and belief in God comes in.
Exactly. Without patience, the whole situation would be quite frustrating and can be quite depressing. But knowing that God is in full control and He will not allow things to get so out of hand that it becomes totally unbearable, we might be tested for a while, but knowing that we're under this test and that God eventually will vindicate us and vindicate the faithful, this gives us much reason for hope and for optimism, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel with God in view.
And on that note of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, thank you, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.